The call lasted 11 minutes. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar had been in longer calls about catering arrangements for diplomatic dinners. 11 minutes was not a negotiation. 11 minutes was not even a conversation in the traditional sense of two parties exchanging information and arriving somewhere neither had been before. 11 minutes was a message. A very loud, very direct, very American message delivered at a volume and with a certainty that left the foreign minister sitting at his desk for a long time after the line went dead, staring at the phone as though it might ring again and tell him he had misheard. He had not misheard. The President of the United States had called at 9:14 in the morning Islamabad time, which was late evening in Washington, which meant the call had not been scheduled through normal diplomatic channels, had not been prepared for by the usual apparatus of talking points and position papers and careful pre-call coordination between staffs. It had come the way this particular president's calls sometimes came, directly and without warning, driven by something he had seen or read or been told in the preceding hours that had pushed him to pick up the phone himself rather than let the machinery of diplomacy handle it at its own pace. The president had said, in the way he said things that he considered self-evident and beyond serious argument, that the time had come. He had said that the Abraham Accords were the greatest diplomatic achievement in the modern history of the Middle East, possibly in the history of diplomacy altogether, and that the nations which had not yet joined them were making a mistake that they would come to regret. He had said that Pakistan was an important country, a country with a lot of potential, a country he had always respected, but that the moment required a decision. He had said that the relationship between the United States and Pakistan was a strong relationship, a relationship built over decades, but that strong relationships required both parties to make strong moves at important moments. He had said that he had spoken to people, very smart people, people who understood the region better than anyone, and the consensus was clear. Pakistan joining the Abraham Accords would change everything. It would be a transformation. It would be historic. It would be the kind of thing that people studied for generations. Then he had said something that Ishaq Dar had not expected, something that changed the texture of the call entirely, something that moved it from the category of presidential enthusiasm into the category of presidential pressure with specific and identifiable consequences attached. He had said he knew about the conversation in Doha. Then the line had gone dead. Dar sat at his desk for 4 minutes without moving. His aide knocked twice before he responded. When he finally looked up, his expression was the expression of a man who has just been informed that a room he believed to be empty has been occupied all along, that the conversation he thought was private was heard, that the position he believed was secure is less secure than it appeared. "Get me the Prime Minister," he said, "and get me Farooq." Farooq Mirza was Pakistan's national security advisor, a careful and precise man who had spent 20 years inside the intelligence and foreign policy apparatus, and who had, more than once, navigated Pakistan through the kind of moment that had no good options, only less bad ones. He arrived at the Foreign Ministry within 25 minutes, which given Islamabad traffic at that hour was itself a statement of urgency. Dar told him about the call, all 11 minutes of it. He recounted it as accurately as he could, not editorializing, not interpreting, just delivering the words as they had been delivered to him, letting Mirza hear them and form his own assessment. Mirza listened without interrupting. When Dar finished, Mirza was quiet for a moment. "He said Doha," Mirza said. "He said Doha." Not a general reference. Not that he had heard things or been told things. He said Doha specifically. "Yes." Mirza stood and walked to the window. Outside, Islamabad was bright and unhurried, the Margala Hills visible in the distance, the city going about its morning as though the foreign minister had not just received a call that had the potential to reorder the country's foreign policy posture in ways that would take years to fully understand. "Then we have a leak," Mirza said. "Or we have surveillance. One or the other, and we need to know which before we can do anything else." The conversation in Doha that the president had referenced had taken place 17 days earlier. It had involved 3 parties, none of them American, and it had been conducted under an understanding of complete confidentiality, in a setting specifically chosen for its discretion. It was a conversation about the Abraham Accords, yes, but it was a conversation about them from a particular angle, a particular set of concerns, a particular framing of what Pakistani participation would mean domestically, regionally, and in terms of the country's relationship with a set of partners whose reaction to such a move could not be predicted with any confidence. Pakistan's position on the Abraham Accords was officially one of principled non-participation. The official position held that normalization with Israel without a resolution of the Palestinian question was not something Pakistan could support given its own history, its commitments, its domestic political realities, and the nature of its relationships across the Muslim world. This position was not merely rhetorical. It was grounded in genuine constraints, genuine convictions held by a significant portion of the country's population, and a genuine assessment of what the regional consequences of a shift would look like. But positions existed in a context, and context changed. The Abraham Accords had brought in countries that had once seemed immovable. The region was different than it had been. The calculations that had seemed fixed were less fixed than they had appeared. And in Doha, 17 days ago, 3 people had sat in a room and spoken carefully and honestly about whether the official position and the actual range of possibilities were still the same thing, or whether they had begun to diverge in ways that required at least a private examination. That conversation was not a decision. It was not a negotiation. It was not a commitment of any kind. It was the kind of conversation that sophisticated foreign policy practitioners have all the time. The kind that never appears in any record, that never becomes a position paper or a briefing document, that exists only as a set of impressions and questions and tentative framings held in the memories of the people who were in the room. And somehow, the President of the United States had known it happened, had known enough to use the word Doha with a confidence that was not a guess, had deployed that knowledge at the end of an 11-minute call like a card placed deliberately on the table at the moment of maximum effect. Mirza turned from the window. What exactly did he ask for? He didn't frame it as a request, Dar said. He framed it as an expectation. He said the time had come for Pakistan to make a decision. He said the decision should be made now. He said he would be following up through proper channels, but that he wanted to have this conversation directly first, person to person, because that was how he preferred to operate. Did he give a timeline? He said he would be speaking to the Prime Minister within the week. Mirza absorbed this. And the consequence? Was there a consequence attached? Dar hesitated. This was the part he had been turning over since the call ended. The President had not made an explicit threat. He was too experienced a communicator, in his particular way, to make explicit threats in the opening move of something like this. But the architecture of the call, the reference to Doha, the language about strong relationships requiring strong moves at important moments, the framing of this as a decision rather than a discussion, all of it pointed in a direction that did not require explicit articulation to be understood. There was no explicit consequence stated, Dar said, but the IMF review is in 6 weeks. The F-16 maintenance agreement renewal is in 2 months, and there are 3 infrastructure projects currently in the pipeline through channels that run through Washington. Mirza nodded slowly. He did not need Dar to connect those dots more explicitly. He had spent 20 years understanding how American pressure worked, the way it never announced itself as pressure, the way it arrived dressed as opportunity or concern or friendly advice, the way the leverage was always visible to the people being pressured without ever being stated in terms that could be quoted or documented or formally protested. We need to talk to the Chinese, Mirza said. Yes, and to Riyadh, because if Washington is making this move now, they've already spoken to Riyadh about it. They would not push Pakistan on this without having prepared the ground regionally. We need to know what Riyadh has been told and what they've indicated, and whether there's a coordinated architecture here or whether this is the president acting on impulse after something he read or was shown. And the Prime Minister. I'll brief him this afternoon. But carefully, this cannot become a public debate. The moment this becomes public, every option narrows. The domestic space for any kind of nuanced response collapses entirely. We need room to think, and we need time to gather information, and we need to do both of those things before anyone outside this building knows the call happened. Dar nodded. He understood this instinctively. 30 years in Pakistani politics had given him a precise and painful understanding of the difference between a problem that could be managed quietly and a problem that had been allowed to become a public crisis before the management had been completed. The second kind was almost always worse than the first, regardless of the underlying substance. There's something else, he said. Mirza looked at him. When he said Doha, the way he said it, Dar paused, choosing words carefully. It didn't sound like intelligence. It sounded like information. There's a difference. Intelligence is something your apparatus gathers and processes and delivers to you in a form that has been filtered through several layers of interpretation. Information is something someone tells you, directly, recently. The way he said Doha, the confidence of it, the specificity, it felt like the latter. Mirza was very still. You think someone told him? I think someone told him. Someone who was either in that room or was told about that room by someone who was. That's a short list. Yes, Dar said. It is. The afternoon briefing with the Prime Minister lasted 2 hours. The Prime Minister was a man who had navigated Pakistani politics through cycles of crisis and recovery that would have broken most people, and he listened to the account of the 11-minute call with the focused stillness of a person who had long since stopped being surprised by the behavior of great powers and had instead developed a highly refined capacity for assessing what any given behavior actually meant in terms of real options and real constraints. When Mirza finished the briefing, the Prime Minister asked 3 questions. He asked what the Americans actually wanted. meaning not the stated objective of Abraham Accords participation, but the underlying strategic interest that the stated objective was serving. He asked what the cost of refusal looked like across a 12-month horizon, taking into account the IMF review, the F-16 situation, and the infrastructure pipeline. And he asked who in Washington was driving this, meaning whether it was the president acting on instinct or whether there was a coherent policy architecture behind the push with institutional support and a long-term strategy attached to it. These were the right questions. Mirza did not have complete answers to any of them. He had partial answers, assessments, informed judgments based on 20 years of experience reading American behavior. The complete answers would require the next several days of quiet inquiry through channels that did not appear in any official record. What he could say with confidence was this: the Americans were not pushing Pakistan toward the Abraham Accords primarily because they believed Pakistan's participation was imminent or even likely. They were pushing because the push itself served a purpose. It demonstrated momentum. It demonstrated that the Accords were still expanding, still relevant, still the organizing framework for a regional order that the United States was actively constructing. Even a public conversation about Pakistani consideration, short of actual participation, was useful to Washington in ways that went beyond the specific outcome, which meant that the 11-minute call was not simply a demand. It was also a test of how Pakistan responded under pressure, of what its risk tolerance was, of how its foreign policy establishment handled the specific and uncomfortable situation of being caught discussing something privately that it had publicly ruled out. The response to the call would itself be information, would tell Washington something about Pakistan's current posture and its future direction. And someone in Islamabad, Mirza thought, sitting across from the Prime Minister in the quiet of the PM's office as the afternoon light moved across the walls, had understood this well enough to be in communication with Washington about it. Someone had understood what the Doha conversation meant in terms of Pakistan's internal calculus and had chosen to share that understanding. The question of who that someone was would, in the weeks ahead, consume a significant portion of his attention. But it would have to wait, because the immediate problem, the problem that required a response within days rather than weeks, was the call itself and what it meant and what Pakistan was going to say when Washington followed up through proper channels as the president had promised it would. The Prime Minister looked at him. "Can we buy time?" "Some," Mirza said. "Not much, and not without a cost." What's the minimum viable response that neither closes the door nor opens it in ways we can't control? This was, Mirza thought, exactly the right question framed in exactly the right way. Not what do we want, not what are our principles, not what does the domestic audience require. The minimum viable response, the thing that kept options open, bought time, acknowledged the pressure without capitulating to it, and did not create a public narrative that hardened positions before the private work had been done. "We acknowledge the call at the working level," he said. "We express appreciation for the President's direct engagement. We communicate that Pakistan takes its relationship with the United States seriously and approaches all regional questions with a commitment to stability and partnership. We say nothing about the Abraham Accords, specifically. We request a working-level consultation on regional architecture before any further direct conversation. We use the consultation to understand what exactly is being asked and what exactly is being offered. And in the meantime, we talk to everyone we need to talk to." The Prime Minister considered this for a long moment. Outside, the light on the Margalla Hills was shifting toward the gold of late afternoon, the city below settling into the rhythm of evening. "Do it," he said. Mirza stood to leave. Then the Prime Minister said, quietly, almost as an afterthought, "The person who told them about Doha." "Yes. Find them before Washington uses them again." Mirza nodded. He walked out of the office and into the corridor and took out his phone and began to make the first of many calls that would constitute, in total, Pakistan's response to 11 minutes that had already changed more than most people in the city yet understood. The hills were gold outside the windows. The city was going about its evening. And somewhere in the architecture of relationships and interests and quiet communications that connected Islamabad to Washington, to Doha, to Riyadh, and back again, a thread was loose, and pulling it carefully, without disturbing everything attached to it, was the work that now had to be done.